welcome to this webinar, Beyond War Ecologies, Green Ways Forward for Ukraine. Extremely important and timely topic for us to be discussing. Before we begin, just a couple of very quick words on some housekeeping issues. The webinar is being recorded and it will be made available online through SIPRI's social media outlets. So it will be possible to go back afterwards and look once again at the interventions from an extremely qualified and fantastic panel of people. I'm not going to introduce them all at once. I'll say a couple of words about each as they take the floor to speak. But maybe first, just to frame the discussion with a few words. If we go back to the period before 2014, Ukraine was actually already a country which faced significant environmental challenges, not least in the eastern part of the country, which was the focal point for Ukraine's heavy industry. So problems of pollution and environmental degradation already existed in Ukraine at a level which made it one of the most difficult environments in a European comparative context. Then, of course, Russia's first aggression in 2014 exacerbated problems, particularly in the East. And the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, for example, has drawn attention to the impact of the 2014 aggression. Factories which suddenly had no competent technical staff or managers, the risks of pollution of the water table by contaminated radioactive water from Ukrainian mines, the problems created by inadequate waste management from agricultural facilities in wartime conditions with a risk of disease, and a list of problems of environment which were exacerbated in 2014 by Russia's first aggression. And then, of course, the second aggression has made matters significantly worse and extended some of the problems to other parts of Ukraine, not just to Donbass. So this event is really intended to raise awareness of some of the environmental challenges. We won't have time in an hour and a half to deal with all topics, but to get some awareness of the scope and extent of environmental damage that Russia has caused in Ukraine, and better understand the context for both the legal framework and also some of the practical issues around restitution, recovery, and rebuilding. And to make sure that when the rebuild happens, it's not simply to put Ukraine back to where it was before the war started, but to really get a more constructive discussion about how to improve things moving forward. So that's really the framing, and our first panelist, Nickolai Denisov, is going to kick us off. He's the deputy director and co-founder of the Zoe Environment Network, which is a non-profit organization in Geneva. He has a doctorate in environment and geography and 20 years or more, in fact, of experience with environmental impact assessments, reporting and communication over environmental challenges, with a focus on Eastern Europe, including the Caucasus and as far as Central Asia. He's been monitoring the environmental impact of the war in Ukraine, and he's going to lead us off with his first presentation. So please, Nickolai, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Jan. I'm starting my presentation and then see if that works. I think it does. You can see it, right? So Zoe Environment Network that I represent is a non-profit in Geneva, and we work with a broad range of environmental issues, from waste to biodiversity and climate. And geographically, we indeed focus around Europe, in Europe's neighborhoods, and then indeed as far as Central Asia. Among the topics, security and conflict is one of the areas where we have been engaged for a relatively long time now, I would say for at least 15 years. And then Eastern Europe, and specifically Ukraine, was part of that. So, of course, when go back. So when the war started in Donbass in 2014, after Russia annexed Crimea, and then also instigated the war in Donbass, we decided to build on our previous environment security work and to start monitoring the environmental impacts in the area. We thought it's important to do. That's one thing we could do. And I think Jan already introduced some of the issue. This is work which was done together with the OSCE, Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. And already then it brought up many things about which we're talking today. So warfare in a heavily industrialized area, which Donbass was, and issues which are very specific, like the flooded coal mines, like damage to Donbass nature, which in fact is rich. It's not obvious for everyone that Donbass in fact has a very rich and interesting nature as well. So a lot of this information was collected, recorded, analyzed. This gave the basis for ideas of what to do about it. And then again, the war was going on, so there were things which could be done immediately, especially in the government control areas. But there also was thinking about what to do in the future, including when Donbass is completely liberated, reunited, fully reunited with Ukraine, and could be rebuilt on the new, sustainable, green, climate-friendly basis. This so far has not happened. What happened instead, Russia started a full-scale invasion in February. So by March already, it was very clear that we're seeing similar kind of damage as we saw in Donbass, but on a much larger scale. And one difference was also the nuclear dimension, which Donbass didn't have. That Ukraine is a nuclear generating country, and then war in a nuclear generating country brings its own challenges. So already in March it was very clear that things are becoming very serious also for the environment, which is usually a silent victim. In the case of Ukraine, in fact, a lot more is known about it than in many other conflicts. In 9 months into the war, between February and November, we see a significant escalation of the damage. This information I'm showing now, it's not conclusive. It's based on open reporting, mostly media, governmental reporting, a little bit social media, but even that already shows that we have over 20,000 events reported in 2,000 settlements. We have more than 1,000 incidents at industrial facilities and critical infrastructure facilities, more than 500 of them hit or disrupted or damaged in some way. We have extensive impacts on forest fires. Forests are burning, not only forests, landscape fires in general, but forests in particular, 10 times larger. The intensity is 10 times higher of forest fires within the war zone than outside, 15 times for coniferous forests, pine and spruce. In Lugansk, for example, there probably are no pine forests left as a result of that, and a lot of protected areas are either occupied or damaged, or both. So the damage is extensive, and unfortunately this is not over, so we're in the middle of it. The timeline shows that whereas for industry on the right-hand side, there have been several waves. Of course, the wave of attacks at the beginning, and then the other one which started in the autumn. Then for cities, things in fact has been escalating and has kept even in the last several months. At least on the level of number of incidents, about 4,000 or 5,000 per month, only again registered officially. And in both cases, both cities and industries, most of the damage registered is direct physical damage. So it's not disruption, it's not operational disruption, it's not only that, but actually physical destruction of infrastructure, of houses, of installations. which again has very dire consequences for the situation as such, but on the environment as well. So this all will have environmental consequences. It brings environmental risks, and then the map shows basically areas of where these risks are concentrated based on what has happened and where. There are no surprises. It's quite clear that industrial areas and densely populated areas where most of the attacks have been concentrated, these are the areas which for now present the highest environmental risks as well. Nuclear I spoke about already, so it's a unique situation where we have permanent and pertinent risks related to radiation, and this goes on. Then the whole range of recent attacks on energy infrastructure. This is only fuel, fossil fuel. It doesn't show generation capacities, which would only add to this. But again, it's fossil fuel, which generates a lot of environmental consequences. For instance, air quality, but also soil pollution, also water pollution. This kind of things. And then industry at large, again, industrial areas do suffer, and that's also a lot of them are in the east, where the front line has been moving back and forth. And then in terms of critical infrastructure, one example is water. Of course, water is absolutely necessary for survival, for the function of cities, for the function of industries, for life of people. And water infrastructure has been targeted at different levels throughout this war, unfortunately. And then we do see the consequences also in terms of water quality, in terms of also impact on the marine environment, etc. There are many players who use this kind of information either for awareness or for planning eventual action. And today we're discussing this second part more. But I would like also to say that awareness is ultra important. I already said that this probably is the best covered conflicts in terms of the environmental implications. Indeed, the media is highly interested in that, including Sweden's neighbors and Sweden itself, of course. I'm sure we Finnish newspaper. I'm sure there is Swedish coverage too. Associated Press, this is the Swiss Neue Zürcher Zeitung, the biggest Swiss newspaper, which ran an article last week, including our data. The map is actually based on our information. And I think it's very positive in a way in the current situation that there is so much inconsistent interest. It's sustained. This topic really stays in the media since, say, March, April, until now, until November, December, which gives hope that this dimension will not be lost. And the most recent reminder of that is the yesterday talk of President Zelensky to the Parliament of New Zealand, where he explicitly suggested that New Zealand takes leads on the eighth point of the peace formula, which was presented at the G19 meeting in Indonesia, which is the environment, ecocide, environmental restoration and protection. And indeed, this is one of the 10 points which are seen important by Ukrainian states on the road to dealing with the war and also recovering from its consequences. So there is a lot of hope, and we do think that joint efforts will eventually succeed. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nickolai, for laying things out in such a clear way. So our next speaker is going to be Doug Weir. Doug is the Research and Policy Director at the, now let's see if I get this right, the Conflict and Environment Observatory. Yes, Conflict and Environment Observatory, who has actually long experience, more than 15 years of looking at the legal framework for protection of the environment in conflict. And he has agreed to give us an indication of what the actual governance system is for environment during wartime. So please, Doug, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ian. I'm actually going to just kind of pick up where Nickolai left off, I think, and have a little bit of a deeper dive into this question of environmental data. So first, thanks to all the SIPRI team for the invitation to contribute to this discussion. In particular, I really want to talk about the volume of environmental data, as Nickolai indicated, this is an unusual conflict, and that will have implications for Ukraine's recovery, and also it's already having an impact on international environmental processes. So just to flip back a little bit, conflicts cause and contribute to a wide range of environmental problems. And this is particularly true where the fighting is prolonged, intense, and affects a very large geographical area. And as is also the case in Ukraine, when the war impacts urban, industrial, and agricultural areas, as well as terrestrial and marine ecosystems. Human rights and ecosystems depend on a healthy environment. However, the environment is typically under-prioritized during and after conflicts. Addressing this under-prioritization requires data and advocacy, and indeed, data is the foundation upon which much else depends. This includes creating the political or financial conditions for technical assessments and assistance on the ground, and for subsequent remedial measures to reduce harm. Obviously, advocacy can also promote accountability, whether for financial reparations or criminal prosecutions. And it's also vital for the norm development that can help reduce future harms. So environmental data collection is foundational to all these outcomes, and therefore the quantity and quality of environmental data is a key determinant of their success or failure. Unsurprisingly, conflicts create considerable barriers for environmental data collection, and these include issues around access and the collapse of peacetime monitoring systems. And at times, environmental data can become acutely politicized, subject to manipulation, or even weaponized. Remote monitoring using Earth observation, social media, and other open sources can help bypass some of these problems, although it can also create new ones in the process. But however it's approached, remote data collection always faces uncertainties and challenges. Nevertheless, if you compare it to the historic model of post-conflict environmental assessments, where you may have had to wait several years before you'd have an internationally recognized report or assessment on the environmental impact, this near real-time remote monitoring is an incredibly powerful tool. So when it comes to environmental visibility, as Nickolai said, Russia's invasion of Ukraine is really unusual in many respects. And that's because you've had this confluence of factors that have boosted environmental narratives around the conflict. These factors include the pre-existing narrative of environmental emergencies that are linked to the fighting in the industrialized East, this quite well-developed government and civil society capacity for environmental monitoring and communication, which isn't something you see in many conflicts. And then you have the scale, intensity, conduct, and nature of the conflict and its relationship to objects such as nuclear power plants or its global impact on agriculture and energy. And then you've also had this highly energetic government diplomacy around environmental damage, and in particular its financial cost. Add to that the affordances of social media, an ecosystem of international civil society entities tracking harm, and then finally this kind of increased sensitivity and a growing appetite in the global media for environmental stories. And climate change is a really good example here. This is the first conflict I can remember where journalists have consistently questioned its impact on global emissions. They were asking this even before researchers developed what's been the first ever emissions estimate for an active conflict. So this confluence of factors has had a number of short-term impacts. For example, it's informed and created space for debate on the environmental dimensions of conflicts in political fora, such as the European Parliament or within the OSCE. These debates have seen parliamentarians and states that have not historically been champions of environmental protection in conflicts take perhaps a far more progressive position than might otherwise have been the case. On a more practical level, the attention has encouraged the establishment of an environmental working group for humanitarian organizations involved in the response. And it's also formed a component of the UN debate around a damage registry and financial reparations, on which Cymie will speak shortly. So the invasion's environmental narrative may also have influenced the conclusion of a decade-long UN process that's created a new legal framework to strengthen the protection of the environment in relation to armed conflicts. And it's fair to say that overall, by the standards of recent and contemporary conflicts, the environmental dimensions of Russia's invasion are highly visible, although this is far more pronounced in European and Western nations than elsewhere. So what are the long-term implications of this? Let's first consider Ukraine's recovery before looking at the impact on processes external to Ukraine. There's no treaty or convention providing for post-conflict environmental assistance or recovery. Historically, initiatives have been ad hoc or of pretty limited temporal or geographical scope or restricted to specific problems. By and large, and despite some discrete high-profile projects, affected states are generally left to deal with the environmental legacy of conflicts themselves, and typically at a time where weak governance and competing priorities render them less capable of doing so. The bulk of recovery funding does not flow towards environmental remediation or restoration. Instead, it goes towards reconstruction, humanitarian assistance, and economic recovery. This is a default, but it's also a default informed by contexts where the environmental dimensions of conflicts have had far less visibility than Ukraine. Moreover, in contexts where there's not been a wider narrative around strengthening environmental governance and socio-economic transition for the benefit of alignment with a trading bloc like the EU. There are also signs that stakeholders are confronting the interconnectedness of the environment, energy, and recovery in ways that are new. So in this respect, Ukraine could perhaps be viewed as a test case, exploring the potential and limitations for environmental data and awareness to drive what has historically been a dream, adequately addressing environmental harm and even building back greener. Beyond Ukraine, data and diplomacy on the conflict's environmental implications is pushing issues of peace and security into multilateral environmental fora that have historically been reluctant to address them. Of course, there have been efforts to mainstream the environment in peace and security fora, like the UN Security Council, for decades, but this has tended to be unidirectional. There's been no corresponding effort to mainstream peace and security in the fora associated with multilateral environmental agreements. Yet in the last month alone, we've seen conflicts raised in a meeting of CITES, at COP15 in Montreal, and perhaps most significantly at COP27. While the climate COP has been struggling with the question of how to count emissions from occupied territories for a few years, COP27 was the first time that the emissions footprint of war has been addressed in a formal side event, and with the data to back it up. While think tanks and states have focused on the climatic risks to security for years, the climatic costs of insecurity have been largely ignored. But is this just a one-off? Can the interest be sustained and followed through to COP28 or COP29? Could we even foresee a point where conflict and military emissions are part of the formal agenda? If so, it could be traced back to COP27 and the attention on Ukraine. Or perhaps states and stakeholders will simply revert back to the safe space of traditional climate security discourse. It'll be interesting to see whether the seeds planted by Ukraine in Sharm el-Sheikh germinate into something more. So, to conclude, the trend towards more comprehensive data collection, Ukraine's aggressive environmental diplomacy, and the support of Western backers have set this conflict apart from those that preceded it. One shift is that environmental diplomacy has forced questions of peace and security into environmental spaces that have historically been reluctant to address them. This is long overdue and could have really positive outcomes in future. However, absent formal assistance mechanisms, the jury is still out as to whether the quantity and quality of environmental data that is being gathered and publicized will translate into sustainable recovery for Ukraine. I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Doug. That's really helped to move our conversation into another area, which I hope we can take up later in a sort of moderated discussion among you all. Next, I'd like to give the floor to Cymie Payne. Cymie is from the Rutgers University. She is a lawyer, I think, and has been legal counsel for the UN Compensation Commission. So this is a great opportunity to give some thought both to how bad behavior might be punished, perhaps through reparations, for example, both to help finance the recovery, but also to send a signal that countries, when they're engaged in hostilities, must take account of the environmental damage they're causing. So Cymie, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ian, and thank you so much to SIPRI for the invitation to join this conversation. So I'll talk about the legal dimensions of environmental reparations and peace building and build on what has already been said by Nickolai and by Doug by taking us a little bit back into some of the history of, what experience do we already have? My perspective is as an international lawyer who has spent many years, 6 years, working for the UN Security Council reparations program that was associated with Iraq's invasion of Kuwait. And particularly, I worked on the environmental damage program. My research since then has been attempting to advance understanding of the environment as key infrastructure and essential cultural heritage that needs to be included in peace building at all stages of policy and legal processes. Here I'm really echoing Doug's message. I'd like to start out by describing the measures that are currently being proposed for Ukraine. And they're twofold. One is creating a register of damage, and the other is creating a reparations mechanism. So the UN General Assembly adopted a resolution L6/2022 last month titled Furtherance of a Remedy and Reparation for Aggression Against Ukraine. The idea is to establish a facility to record and assess Ukraine's claims against Russia. And it would be for the whole scope of damage, not just environmental, but it would include environmental harm. Alone, this process would not result in environmental restoration. The function would be, as Ian just indicated, to provide accountability, making a record, and to make a record, and to prepare should compensation become a possibility. A reparations mechanism has been deferred to the future. So rather than creating a compensation commission now with no certainty of being able to actually pay out awards, that's been set aside, and the evidence collection assessment has been the initial focus. The approach was chosen based on some fundamental rules of international law that are also informed by past experiences with reparations processes. And thinking about environment in this context is really quite new. It really began with the UN Compensation Commission's treatment of the harm from Iraq's invasion of Kuwait. As a general matter, the goals of legal reparations in international law are essentially twofold: accountability and restoration. Accountability supports the rule of law and justice. When a state breaches its international legal obligations, international law holds that it is responsible for reparations to the injured state or states. So in this case, Russia breached the UN Charter, Article 2, obligation to refrain from the threat or use of force against the territorial integrity of any state, and committed the crime of aggression when it attacked Ukraine. The restoration aspect is intended to put the injured party in the position it would have been but for the illegal acts that caused harm. This is a particularly important aspect of peace building, and it can provide a sense that justice has been done as well. And so we would say Russia is legally liable to restore the damage it's caused to Ukraine in those terms. But this question that is at the heart of today's meeting is really, can we do better than that? Can we do better than restoring to the previous condition? I'm not going to go into detail on that. I'm flagging that that is a legal issue that is quite interesting to discuss. And hopefully we will be able to get to it. I want to comment briefly on the criminal law role. So environmental destruction can itself be considered a war crime under the International Criminal Court's statute, or perhaps as ecocide. The International Criminal Court has already been seized of this issue, and has said it will cooperate with other efforts to hold Russia and its leaders accountable, which is also going to be a kind of new experience in this context. Criminal law is very good for accountability. It's not so good for restoration. Proof is very difficult. The potential for counterclaims against Ukraine is there. And most important, for environmental recovery, defendants are individuals, not the state. So they have limited resources available to pay for rebuilding and reinstatement of damaged environment. Civil reparations approach is preferable, where the main goal is environmental recovery. Now, the model of the register of damage without a compensation fund really comes from the World Court, the International Court of Justice's advisory opinion on the separation wall built by Israel and the Palestinian territories. And the General Assembly, after that advisory opinion, decided to establish the United Nations Register of Damage caused by the construction of the wall in the occupied Palestinian territory, to take in claims from Palestinians who were harmed by the wall, with no intent, no immediate prospect of any kind of financial or other compensation, but to make a record. For assessment, compensation, and restoration of environmental damage, the UN Compensation Commission is the model that current proposals for Ukraine are based on when we get to the greater detail of the scope, the forms, for claims, all of that kind of thing. So briefly, the 1999 to 91 war, Iraq invaded and occupied Kuwait. The UN Security Council established a compensation commission that from around 1991 began reviewing claims. It eventually got to the environment in 1999, took 6 years to review the claims. There were $85 billion of damage to the environment claimed, and awards were made and paid for something over $5 billion. So really extensive and a successful program because the funds were actually paid. These were government claims, not private claims, and they were paid for damage to groundwater aquifers, desert, coastal, and marine ecosystems, and wildlife. This process developed a jurisprudence and methods for evaluating environmental damage and restoring ecosystems. For the first time, the environment was treated in an ecocentric way. And the claims, well, I'm going to skip a little bit about some of the detail here, but I wanted to say that the focus of the commission on ecological function is quite important. And again, somewhat novel, because it might mean that there would be a less aesthetic solution that would actually kickstart the recovery of the ecosystems. There have been a number of proceedings that followed the UNCC, and while there's been recognition that courts and arbitral tribunals can be helpful in moving a fight from the battlefield to the courtroom, in those cases, relatively little evidence was collected and submitted to support environmental damage claims. And in one case, there were no awards for environmental damage. In others, there was a small amount awarded. So the message there, and again, echoing what Doug has said, adequate evidence of harm is essential for successful legal proceedings. For Ukraine, there is a lot of evidence, but how it is collected is of the first importance and how successful it will be in court. And my colleague from industrial economics, Bob Unsworth, and I had some opportunities to share our experience with these kinds of things with the Ministry of Environment. If I can take one extra minute. Oh, I know I'm a little over time. I apologize.
Yeah, 1 minute is the limit of what you can.
Okay, I'll speak fast. I did want to comment briefly on how reparations programs can more effectively contribute to a greener reconstruction. So a broad definition of environment and natural resources that is both anthropocentric and ecocentric and not limited by market or ecosystem services approaches. Second, a goal to restore ecological function. And third, if it's possible to come up with creative solutions. The processes I've spoken about are all financial compensation, but sometimes there may be alternatives that we're not used to dealing with in legal processes that would lead to the kind of green reconstruction that we are hoping for. That's better than it was. Thank you so much for your attention, and my apologies for going over.
Oh, no problem. I'm sure we can return to some of those questions also later on before we end the webinar in the discussion period. But I'd like to give the floor next to Anna Ackermann. Anna is a climate and energy policy specialist at the International Institute for Sustainable Development. And she's a board member of one of Ukraine's most important environmental NGOs, the Center for Environmental Initiatives, Ecoaction. So she has a great deal of first-hand experience of how Ukraine has suffered in the conflict, and also thoughts about what can be done, not just to reproduce the version of Ukraine that existed in 2014, but to provide a better future. So Anna, please, the floor is yours. I know you have a presentation to share, which includes the creative use of the T72 in its version we've become accustomed to seeing, the open-air cabriolet version. So please.
Thank you very much. Sharing my screen in a second. Do you see my screen? No, I think it's again. Just a second. Sorry, it didn't work. Trying again. Well, in any case, I'll start here while I'm trying to share the screen. So the and it's interesting image that I'm starting with. There you go. I really like starting with this particular one because this is the north of Ukraine, right after Russian forces left. Well, we can say were kicked out of the north of Kiev, and it was spring, so people immediately started planting whatever they had at hand, like cabbages, just near the tanks that were destroyed with the Russian army. And there is everything in this photo. In fact, I think it's very visual because on one hand, it gives a sense of life and how people in Ukraine, want to be still want to recover, want to keep living, and want to, plant their vegetable gardens and everything. But they don't necessarily think of what is this soil like or water, is like right at this spot because maybe it is polluted. And this is what the war is like. You don't necessarily think of environment. We, of course, see this in all the other conflicts and wars happening, and we see this in Ukraine when environment is not a priority. But this is why I will speak now more about what our organization has been doing in terms of tracking the damages to the environment, but also opening up a bit of other important topics, which are also, I think, with a broader scope, are also important, which is climate and also the green reconstruction of Ukraine, and what we as civil society in Ukraine and also in the whole of Europe who work on Ukraine, what we see is important. And also we'll go back to a few things that I heard, which are very precious from the colleagues with whom we've been in touch since the full-scale invasion. In fact, just to say that Ecoaction is the organization that has been mostly working on sustainable agriculture, sustainable energy. But then we thought that in spring, that what we could do is that we can try to collect all of this information about damages to the environment. First, we were naive because we didn't know much. We thought they were called environmental crimes, but then we realized, thanks to the colleagues, that actually it's not that easy in the real world. So we collected for the moment more than 700 cases of damages to the environment. And it's interesting, I was checking out with my colleagues. So currently the system has been filled by our volunteers who do this in their free time, who help us to fill in this, the Excel sheet and then to have this map. We do this mostly for communication purpose, and we collect information from media resources, mostly whatever is available publicly. But then when we see what the Ministry of Environment is, the Ukrainian Ministry of Environment is communicating, is more like 2,000 cases of damages to the environment. And we are not sure where they're getting this information from. So we don't, and because at the moment there is restrictions, and this is something that Duke was mentioning, regarding data access of all the different sorts. So we were requesting information to ministries, again, all the different sorts of information for our work, but very often we don't get any replies at all, because at the moment during the wartime, it's possible that we would not have any replies. So in any case, we are using this map to inform. And I think it's also interesting and important, although Nickolai is very correct and correctly said that how the situation has been dramatic in terms of the damages to the environment in eastern regions of Ukraine, Donetsk and Lugansk region since 2014. But we see that the regions that have most of the cases that we see, at least, are not Donetsk and Lugansk, but the regions which are close to the front line, which is Dnipro, Kharkiv, Mykolaiv, Zaporizhia, where lots of industrial facilities are being damaged. And that is, of course, because Russia, because again, we can see that we can take the city of Donetsk, which has been occupied since 2014, but it has not been damaged that much, while all of the regions close to the front lines are the ones who are suffering the most. And I'll show you the map of regions of Ukraine, how they look like, how Ukraine functions now as a system. And I think it's an important message also for Ukraine's reconstruction, what it actually means region by region. Just to say that although we hear that in the news, and of course, and Nickolai briefly mentioned about the dangers, we have to be remembering about the Zaporizhia nuclear power plant that has been occupied. Also from the perspective, this is the largest nuclear power plant in Europe. Every now and then, every week or two, Russia is shelling the nuclear power plant, or there would be, missiles flying over. And although there have been so many attempts to do something, and there have been the International Atomic Energy Agency mission to the plant, but in the end, I mean, it's not getting resolved. So hopefully it will be. But the main question, even if we imagine the situation of Russian troops, and international will be agreed that Russian troops have to quit or their military base have to move from the power plant, this should not be left, unsolved in terms that Russia should still be held accountable. There has been no sanctions whatsoever on nuclear energy sector. There have been all the other ones. And Rosatom basically is a state nuclear company acting as a nuclear terrorist state, by occupying this power plant, by shelling it all the time, and by putting the whole of Europe and the world under the danger. I guess everybody hears this, but I just want to repeat that now the question should be about denuclearization of Russia. Whatever Russia wanted to do with Ukraine, we should be questioning what should be the future of Russia in that sense. Again, if we don't leave this case unanswered, we set a precedent for any future threats for all the other countries and conflicts in the future. And, peacefully looking how the radiation may spread at all of this modeling that we see from month to month appearing. So about now building better and greener, an important thing here is that it's important from perspective of all the organizations who work on the topic to be starting already now. Of course, we want a brighter future for Ukraine. And actually, I actually missed one important aspect is the not only environmental consequences, but climate consequences. This is something that Doug mentioned also. So at COP27, this very publication was presented, and the data of the climate consequences of this war. You can find it easily. What's important is that the consequences go beyond out of Ukraine, because there's been leakage to the Nord Stream pipelines with all the Ukrainian refugees who moved to Europe, and all the emissions that increased because of that. And of course, internationally speaking, the situation has changed so much. So we'll see what we will have in terms of climate consequences, in terms of emissions increase probably this year, how it will look like. But there will be for sure one important aspect is reconstruction of Ukraine once the war is over, how much emissions will be there. And we know that for reconstruction, the emissions would just spike a lot. So we'll see what that would lead to. At the moment, of course, what Russia did is that it destroyed Ukrainian economy. And the emissions are, of course, dropped dramatically. Only Mariupol, basically meant that minus probably 10% of Ukrainian greenhouse gas emissions can be removed. These are just some of the principles. I probably would not be talking too much about all of them, but in any case, the NGOs agreed on what it means, what are the principles for green reconstruction, and it goes beyond just environmental standards or environmental aspects. It's a lot about taking people on the spots, municipalities, act in a transparent way and also have access to information that then can decide what they want for themselves in terms of reconstruction, and also effective functioning of and use of resources and so on, and the development of the green economy and so on. So we talk very often about green reconstruction, but in fact, did Ukraine already define that it wants its reconstruction to be green? Well, no, we haven't defined what our economy would be looking like in the future, as well as we haven't defined yet what our energy mix would be looking like. And that actually puts into question what kind of investments we'll be getting. Well, all the different sorts probably. Oh, it's frozen a bit. This is how the map looks like. This is what the government kind of presented back in Lugano for the reconstruction conference. But it's important to understand, how again, there are some backline regions marked in yellow in the West, which are functioning and whose economy actually started growing during this year because of all of the internal refugee inflows into those parts of the country. And there are support regions close to the front line, which again are actually badly damaged. Also, the environment there is also been badly damaged. And all of these regions have to be viewed differently in terms of reconstruction. What is important here, just to say that reconstruction has to start already now, otherwise we'll lose lots of time. It has to be region specific in any case. But we are trying to call all of the investors to think of coming already now or establishing the connections with municipalities, with those regions which are at least in the West, now in the North, to start up this work. It could be preparation of drafts, policies, strategies, projects, whatever, already now for after wartime. Whatever is good. So, and then we defined the Ecoaction, the green reconstruction as a sustainable construction realized using best available technologies and practices. But in order to achieve this, again, we have to work already hard now and to actually define these new standards in Ukraine. So we have lots of homework to do, and also in terms of advocacy work with our government. And at the same time, we are questioning what would be the demands of those donors who would be coming to Ukraine, bringing resources to Ukraine. What would be their demands from Ukraine? Would they want to rebuild better? Well, not necessarily, because when we talk with the representatives of Czech Republic, Poland, they say, well, the businesses just will come and do business as usual, unless there are some rules which are defined, unless we define that reconstruction is green and we define what it actually means in practice. What are the standards that have to be there and so on. This has not been done. It looks like we will, as there has been no precedent at all in the world of a green reconstruction after the war. I doubt it will be green as such. We'll do many mistakes, but we will try to do everything so that it will be greener than business as usual. And one thing I want to finish, because I understand I'm taking also lots of time and so on. Just on a kind of also positive note, where is it? There is the, it's a bit buggy, on energy side and energy security. This is just to also give you an idea of what it is, what it may feel like to actually have a green reconstruction, which is sorry, not about environment, it's about energy, but also as important. So as Russia has been attacking Ukrainian energy infrastructure, what has been happening is that people all over the place, also municipalities, understood how great it actually is to have small-scale energy production right on the spot where you are. For the moment, it may be diesel generators, but some are installing solar panels with storage systems and heat pumps, and they understand it's important. So in fact, what's been happening is that we start having people realizing what actually it is to have this the first sparkles of the green economy, what it actually could look like. People don't think about this in terms of green reconstruction. They think about security and resilience, and this is how we are also trying to communicate what has to be done through security and through resilience. So I'm stopping there. Sorry for taking more time.
Mm-hmm. No, thank you, Anna. And again, we can come back to some of these questions later in the discussion. So I'd like to move straight on to Torbjo and Becker. Torbjörn is the director of the Stockholm Institute of Transition Economics at the School of Economics, Stockholm School of Economics. He has many research partners in different parts of Europe, but one of his most important is, I think it's fair to say, the Kiev School of Economics. And together with KSE, Torbjörn has actually already started the process of thinking in more detail about how the resources can be mobilized both at the scale but also in the coordinated way that will be necessary to promote recovery. So Torbjörn, I'd just like to immediately give you the floor really for your thoughts on how this enormous task of reconstruction can be approached.
Thank you, Ian. Pleasure being with you here today. I want to start pointing out the somewhat embarrassing fact in this group of experts that I'm not really the environmental expert, but I have been quite a lot involved in discussing the reconstruction of Ukraine in different fora and from different angles. So I'm learning a lot when I'm part of this discussion. So I really appreciate this opportunity to be here with you this evening. I wanted to start with something quite simple, but I think also important, and it's the very basic fact that for each day this war is going on, the cost of rebuilding anything from environment to houses, people's lives, that cost is increasing every single day. So I was just in a different discussion the other day about this, and someone said that when you talk to people in Ukraine, they are all basically saying that extra marginal dollar that we're spending in Ukraine should be about defending the country, basically, making sure that the missiles are not hitting the green infrastructure that has been built. We saw the destroyed solar panels. We have examples of windmills being hit by rockets, etc., etc. So I really think it's important to start all of the discussions on reconstruction with the simple fact that we need to do whatever we can to make this war stop as soon as possible. And that should be the number one priority. Of course, at the same time, I think it's extremely important that people like the experts we have heard here today are thinking about systematic ways of collecting data and assessing damages. And we have our colleagues, like you mentioned, Ian, at the Kiev School of Economics, and they have been very active in assessing damages to infrastructure, to housing, to bridges, etc., etc. But I'm very happy to see that there is also this very careful data collection and analysis of what's going on the environmental side, which is, of course, crucially important when it comes to what's going on in Ukraine. So really high praise for your efforts in this area. I just want to mention briefly a little bit about a project I have been involved with several people from the Kiev School, but basically in a big group of international scholars, both from Ukraine but from other parts of the world as well. So we set out to write the blueprint for the reconstruction of Ukraine, which was published already in April, because we were, of course, thinking that once the war is over, we should have the plan ready immediately. We should not, like the Marshall Plan, wait for a couple of years after the war ends before we have a plan. So we set out with that. And just recently, this last week, there is now a book that the CEPR has issued with the title Rebuilding Ukraine, Principles and Policies. And that book has, I think, 14 chapters, many pages to read, not all of them being so detailed with the environmental aspects that we have been discussed here. But what we say in this book, which I think is very important and really connects to what we have heard here, is that, just to cite what is in the book, reconstruction is not about rebuilding Ukraine to the pre-war state. It is about a deep modernization of the country, infrastructure, technology, business environment, institutions, education, healthcare, and other critical elements of the economy and society will have to leapfrog and undergo reforms to help Ukraine escape the post-Soviet legacy, etc. So I think this is very much in line with what we have heard here. And some of the chapters go very explicitly into how Ukraine can be rebuilt greener and better from an environmental and climate perspective. In particular, of course, the chapter dealing with the energy, but also in the other chapters, this is quite clear. And I also want to mention a couple of things that were touched on here, which is that when we try to think about the institutional setup for the reconstruction of Ukraine, we argue that this should be a coordinated process with a very strong Ukrainian ownership. It should be the Ukrainian government with engagement from local government, civil society, activists, and researchers, all of them making the priorities of how to rebuild the country. So I don't actually think we should think of this as a process where foreign investors come and say we should be doing business as usual in Ukraine. I don't think that's what the Ukrainian government or people in Ukraine would be looking for. I also don't think it's what the donor countries that are going to be involved in this process will be looking for either. We know that the long-term goal of Ukraine is now also to become an EU member. So with that, I think there's a lot of environmental issues that Ukraine will also deal with in that process. We also know that the big investments banks like World Bank, EBRD, EIB, etc., that will be involved in this process, they are all very much aware of climate and environmental impact things. So I really hope and think that the environment will become an important part of the reconstruction of Ukraine. And I think it's going to be much easier to fund the reconstruction of Ukraine if that perspective is really put at the center of the reconstruction process. I think very few donors, regardless of what maybe some said here, I think most donors would have this as a condition in the reconstruction, that it needs to be an environmental and climate perspective linked to a lot of the investments that they would like to be part of financing for Ukraine. I also want to just note that in this process, it's going to require a lot of other things that we may not think of immediately when we talk about the reconstruction process. In many discussions I've been listening to, it's a lot of focus on rebuilding stuff. And I think, one important ingredient here is really to upgrade human capital and make sort of the smart, well-educated, very clever people of Ukraine also have an opportunity to be, a very important factor in this reconstruction. And I think a lot of those people understand that sort of the green transition is really something that they want for their own future in Ukraine. So I'm a little bit more hopeful, but I think also donors need to be very much aware of the fact that we should be thinking about serious investments in human capital to go along with a lot of the other more hard sort of infrastructure that we're going to rebuild in this. I also want to just end sharing a personal reflection from what we're now doing with the Kyiv School of Economics. As we're speaking, basically, we are putting together sort of an emergency kit. We're going to drive down to Ukraine in the next week, basically with both diesel generators, but also with solar panels and very big batteries. So we can just see now that we do need to be aware of the fact that they need to have power, they need to have heat, they need to have the basics of life. And it may actually come to some extent at the cost of what we're doing to the environment. It's kind of not our first choice, of course. So diesel generators are going to be quite the thing that's going down to Ukraine. And I can tell you from trying to get hold of diesel generators now to send down to Ukraine, there are a lot of diesel generators all over Europe now going to Ukraine. So of course, this is not going to be helpful for the environment or climate in the short run. But again, our friends down there, they were themselves saying, we want to check out how these things with solar panels work. So in addition to sending the diesel generators that we know can take care of some of the issues short run in the winter, we're sending down a couple of solar panel equipment with batteries to have them test out basically a much more environmental friendly solution for the longer run. But again, I think this is going to be a bit of a challenge in the short run. It's going to be a lot of power generated in not so environmentally friendly ways over this winter. And again, I just think this emphasizes the point that we really need to help Ukraine win this war sooner rather than later. That's going to be the best way to help the environment at this stage. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Torbjørn. And I hope we can come back to this issue of sequencing when we get to the general conversation and what needs to be done in which order. I hope we can have more conversations about that in the remainder of the webinar. But next, I'd like to give the floor to Claire McAllister, a colleague from SIPRI. Claire is the project lead on SIPRI's Environment for Peace initiative. Her background is as a civil servant in the UK, working already very much with environmental issues. And the UK civil service, as you know, is generally considered the Rolls-Royce of civil services. But in moving to SIPRI, Claire has now become, if you like, the Tesla Model X, as opposed to the gas-guzzling Rolls-Royce. So Claire, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Ian, and thanks so much to all the panelists. I've been given the unenviable task of trying to give some concluding comments and to bring together the threads of what we've heard from the panel. So I also start this maybe with the disclaimer that you are all far more expert in these questions than I am, and I've learned a lot just from sitting here today. I mean, I wanted to try and it's very obvious, but can never be reiterated that the impact, the environmental impact has been huge, and the challenges really we're looking at in Ukraine are twofold, because we both have the extensive damage from the war, which is compounding already existing environmental challenges in Ukraine. And I think across the panelists, we really saw the different layers of environmental damage that we're seeing from this war. They're the local and community aspects, where kind of individual kind of pieces of infrastructure are being attacked, but it's also that kind of societal, national degradation of kind of the ecological services and the ecological functions, through whether that be degradation of forests or water pollution or air pollution. So there's that huge impact. And then we have the international impact of the climate consequences of the emissions that are going into this war. And on top of that, this sort of geopolitical impacts, which of how much the war is diverting resource, is diverting kind of both people time and also financial resource into addressing the war, which could be otherwise addressing these huge challenges around climate change and biodiversity. And then on top of that, I guess we also have some of these compounding crises, whereby the war in Ukraine is at the same time as poor harvests caused by climate change in India and China, and creating food security in other parts of the world. So it's also, being an input into other further crises. And the longer it goes on, as Torbjørn clearly said, the greater the damage. And I guess I really do hear from the opportunities that must try to be grasped, and how they are opportunities, but they must be kind of managed very carefully, and we must be conscious of the kind of potential risks. And those opportunities come both from this quality and the quantity and the evidence, which will be so powerful, and also the focus from both internationally and within Ukraine on the environmental damage. And really, I kind of saw that coming, these potentials in 4 places. I mean, one, the potential to really adequately address this environmental harm that has been, was really clearly talked about, the potential to then try to translate that into a green reconstruction in terms of what comes next, the potential for these environmental questions, these peace and security questions, to get more clearly on the environmental agenda, and then just the pure pragmatic kind of needs of people in Ukraine, meaning that they are turning to green sources of energy just from a very, sort of basic ground up need of energy and a more resilient kind of in response to kind of the impact that the devastation is causing. So one of the things that I think I kind of draw from the Environment of Peace report, which we published in May, is that, one of the key findings of our report, which was more looking at how environment and climate change was impacting on peace and security than vice versa, but was really that, there are huge opportunities in the green transition for kind of to build community resilience and peace, but actually only if they are done in the right way. And we see in the report that there is evidence across the world of how transition policies, if not designed in the right way, can actually exacerbate existing conflicts or create new conflicts. And obviously, as we move into a green transition, we need to make sure that in designing those policies and in setting kind of that direction, that we think about some of those lessons learned from other parts of the world where transition policies have had these unintended social consequences while trying to meet an environmental aim. And I think some of the principles that Anna was pointing to in terms of kind of this is about kind of local communities understanding their needs, thinking about the regional context, being sort of, I guess, led from kind of that sort of locally led approach, I think, is really important, and being owned by kind of the people that are going to be most affected by those transition policies. And that's, I think, some of the learning that we've had from the Environment of Peace report is really that kind of the more that individuals and communities that are most likely to be affected are included are consulted and have their interests reflected in how these transition policies should be designed, the more likely they are, that more effective they are, and also the less conflict that they create. And so we really talk about this kind of just and peaceful transition, and how do we ensure that we bring the kind of the sort of social side really of the transition. And so I think this is looking not just at what we understand from the kind of technical side, but also that understanding that these are social processes, and we really need to kind of hear the voices of all the people that will be affected. And I guess I particularly instinctively think there are a number of people that will be affected by these policies that are currently not in Ukraine. There is a huge amount of people that have had to move out of Ukraine or move away from their place where they would kind of return back to. And how do we make sure that those voices, and from a gender perspective, maybe in particular some of the kind of female voices and some of the kind of young people's voices who potentially are not there to advocate for what they think currently they will need in the future. So I think I'll stop there, but just to kind of, I think there are some principles and recommendations from our report, while not kind of directly kind of addressing Ukraine, that can hopefully be helpful, and some of the case studies from other parts of the world that can be kind of interesting inputs for how you really create this green reconstruction that's kind of supports state kind of reconstruction and rebuilding of communities and societies, as well as the kind of physical infrastructure.
Okay, thank you. So now I'd really like to get the panelists to engage with each other, perhaps if possible, but around a couple of questions to start with. The first of them relates to the issue of sequencing, if you like, and what needs to be done when. The reason for asking that is I've been in a number of conversations around topics like this related to the war recently. And at the risk of oversimplification, there are basically two things that you hear which are very difficult to reconcile. One view is that things have to begin immediately, not just to try and offset some of the terrible damage that's been done to the lives of Ukrainian people, but also for pragmatic reasons that unless Ukraine's economy begins to recover, we're going to be locked in a whole series of 6-month conversations in Europe about leveraging 18 million, 20 billion euros of humanitarian support for Ukraine. And so we have to get the Ukrainian economy moving. And then there is a second group of people who say, actually nothing useful can be done until the fighting stops, because the scale of the task means you're going to have a lot of engagement from the private sector, and private contractors will find it very difficult to operate in a high-risk environment without the sorts of legal guarantees and also contractual guarantees that would at least give them some risk management and also some safety for their staff. So both approaches, that we must begin immediately and we must invest now, and also that we need to be a little bit careful about thinking about when we actually make very large investments in Ukraine. Both of them have a sort of reasonable underpinning, if you like, of arguments. So I'd be very interested if any of the panelists would like to make some comment. A number of you did say that the time to begin is now. Would people like to develop that idea further?
Can I maybe just say from the financial side, there's a lot of discussion now about how can maybe donors or IFIs develop new instruments so the private sector can actually both engage in investments and activities, but also sort of export and import businesses with Ukraine to keep the economy going. I think there is a challenge with the fact that most credit guarantee instruments that countries are used to dealing with is not useful in a war situation like this. But I don't think it doesn't seem to be rocket science that we need to provide these guarantees one way or the other for exactly the reasons you mentioned. So, but the question is always who's going to actually pay up if things don't work out, and that's where I think donors have a little bit difficult time to agree on these principles.
Yeah.
I really thought that maybe Torbjo would comment on that, so I could, of course, completely agree. And there are already discussions about the guarantees from the World Bank and all the IFIs. Why I mentioned that it would be good to be thinking about this now, because in fact there are already some examples. Recently at COP, actually, I was discussing with a representative of one of Ukrainian cities in the West, and she said during the wartime they had a business from Finland, so a private company from Finland that got installed in their city, and they are operating successfully. They are very happy because they feel they're also supporting Ukraine in that way. So it's not like we are not inventing the wheel. There are some examples of different sorts that are already there. So it depends, of course, on the circumstances. What I think, there is one very interesting thing, that a map that our prime minister was showing also in Lugano, how the government was first suggesting countries to take on one region in Ukraine and be responsible for reconstruction of this specific region. Like let Denmark take Nickolai region and restore it, And of course it would not work this way. of course, we will have all of the different mechanisms and tools in place, and all of different types of cooperation between cities and cities, companies and companies, governments with government, and government with municipalities, and so on. And this is the way to go. So wherever there is a way to establish this cooperation already now, and some cities in Ukraine don't have twinning cities in Europe or anywhere in the world, and it's an opportunity to start thinking with them strategically, especially as municipalities have to develop their reconstruction plans too. To sum up, as I mentioned, now it's also the time, if we don't talk about businesses, it's also the great time to think about what kind of new building standards we would need for reconstruction, and all of the kind of brain and analytical work that needs to be done already today. And this is something that KSC started, and all of the different analytical centers all around the world doing, and this is it is the way to go, and to be as clear as possible, and hopefully these recommendations will be heard in Ukraine too.
Thank you. Yes, no, it's very, very good point. I mean, of course, the reality is that even if the fighting stops, we would be very far from peace. Mr. Putin has staked his reputation on the failure of Ukraine, and Western countries have invested an enormous amount of prestige in the success of Ukraine. So we are going to be facing this problem for the indefinite future. And another question, a couple of questions which have come in from some of our audience online, focus on the issue of compensation and accountability. Cymie, I wonder if you could also, if you're able, make some comments on some of the ideas which have put forward in Europe. For example, the idea that seized assets will be placed in a fund which will be aggressively managed, and then the profits from the aggressive management of the funds will be given to Ukraine without touching the original capital, so that you would simultaneously preserve the reversibility of sanctions, if you like, but also provide Ukraine with an income stream. From a lawyer's point of view, how would you see that? A number of people have raised the question of whether that is compatible with existing approaches. And we've also had a question whether you could elaborate a little bit more on the UNCC and how it might engage moving forward with Ukraine.
Great, thank you for those questions. On your first question, I'm not a financial manager, so my sense is that you'd need a really good financial manager for that to actually work. Find a stock that will rise in value the way Apple or Tesla have, or Microsoft, and hope for the best. Whether that's legally feasible, there's actually there's different pots of money. There's, for instance, the Russian bank. There's the oligarchs' funds. There's all these different kinds of funds that people are looking at that have been, many of which have been frozen. People have also talked about doing what was done with Iraq, which is taking a percentage of oil revenues and using that to fund. That's great if you can actually put sanctions so that you can control the sale of Russia's oil and gas. As I said, it's not my expertise in how those things would work, but there are a lot of legal complications in actually seizing and making use of those funds. And I would be a little concerned, even if you were thinking about just taking profit off of invested assets, whether that is actually going to be legal for certain kinds of assets. That's a whole webinar of its own on what can be done with that. I noticed that the UNCC question seemed a bit skeptical, and I wanted to be clear that UNCC is not a model for rebuilding Ukraine. It's a model for an international legal compensation mechanism that could provide, potentially, its benefits are providing some funding through compensation awards, and something else that is less easy to ascertain, which is a sense of justice, that, there's some accountability, that justice has been done. As a legal process, the UNCC is worth looking at because it had literally millions of claims. It had billions of dollars claimed and awarded and paid And it had a process where the payments that were to individuals who had individual harm had to be documented to have been paid to those individuals. The environmental awards had to be used for environmental recovery. So it had some unusual features that are really huge leaps forward in compensation from armed conflict. And but that said, there are ways we can improve on it, particularly this question about building back better. And that is a legal question. And I'm happy to talk about it more, but I don't want to take up too much time, so I'll leave it there.
Thank you. Maybe we could add one more dimension to that. It was mentioned that, the attacks on the power plants have been mentioned by a couple of the presenters, and there is an international convention for the suppression of nuclear terrorism. And what's happened in Ukraine actually meets the legal definition of nuclear terrorism. And I've heard it said in some discussions that once you have an act of terrorism, you open up whole new legal possibilities for asset seizure and redirection of seized assets. Is that something that you have followed? I think it's been something that OFAC has looked at in the United States.
Yeah, again, this is not my area of expertise, and so I don't think I should comment on that. I think that what I can say is that you have to look at who holds the asset. There's a thread that runs through all of this. In a legal process, it's got a rigidity to it that requires that an act that is illegal be the cause of the harm, and that you show that, and that the source of compensation or culpability, remedy, has to be associated with the actor that caused the harm. So you do have to be very careful about that.
Yeah, thank you. Anna, there's one question that's come in, which I think would be very interesting for you to comment on, though others, of course, are also free to do so. And that is how civil society can be brought into the conversation as a sort of enabler moving forward, both of progress in promoting green recovery, but also in some of the legal issues which Cymie has been talking about.
Thank you. I also see, I think in the Q&A that there is a question also about civil society engagement in gathering evidence for environmental harm. So I guess I'll comment on that too, just to say that there are, and I think even in today, in the participants who are listening to us today, I saw a colleague from Environment People Law, who is one of the organizations who is doing exactly that. They are gathering the evidence and collecting it. They know better to which extent this cooperation could lead to the further judicial procedures and so on. And I think Ukrainian Nature Conservation Network Organization group, Ukrainian Nature Conservation Group, they also do this. So there are some organizations who do exactly that. From our side, we are communicating, and the same on the green reconstruction. We are communicating through the damages to the environment, this issue, also talking again about Ukraine, but from another perspective, which as actually our speakers today pointed out, for the first time probably in history, there has been lots of interest in media to this particular topic. So we thought that it's a great opportunity for us to show why this is important. And, I actually marked it also. I was making notes and I marked it in bold just to say that how unfortunate that we need a big disaster like this to happen so that things will start moving ahead, in all of the international discussions and the UN and everywhere else. Very unfortunate, but I guess this is the way it is. On the green reconstruction shortly, what the civil society has been doing, and this is why I was talking about working with municipalities. We work a lot with municipalities. Their civil society has been engaged in Ukraine so much during the wartime. So all of the NGOs, I think, all the active ones, including Ecoaction, we've been also providing humanitarian aid, but at the same time, working with municipalities, thinking together with them how to reconstruct better. Many NGOs found municipalities, and said, okay, let's think strategically what to do, how to do. We start having some projects, typically in Kyiv region. Recently, we also had a kindergarten where we installed heat pump and solar panel with storage to see how it works, to see how, this is actually to Torbjo also regarding, like, there was interest on how this thing works. So we also want to have these projects in place. So I think it's the first time when we also have some possibility. I mean, it's never enough, but some possibility to even have some through donations, some projects to help communities very concretely, and they're very grateful for this. And also through this to promote this idea of what green reconstruction could be like, what it is, and so on. And the same with agriculture also, and all of the different, anyway, not going into details. But civil society is now probably the most important kind of moving driver of these topics. So I would say that way.
Thank you so much. No, it's enormously complex with the three different levels, if you like. The base level of engagement with society, where you have this enormous energy in Ukrainian society to do something, while at the same time having the need really for state building, for building a new state on a basis of equity. So without, in the medium term, privileging particular parts of Ukraine, but having equity across the board. And at the same time, the international dimension of Ukraine as a candidate country, having to simultaneously build a new state, state within the framework of accession to the European Union. So enormously complex set of tasks. I'd like to give all of the panelists just the opportunity for a couple of concluding remarks before we finish. Maybe we kind of go in reverse order and just ask people in one or two sentences to say what they think are the main priorities right now. What are the things that need to be done urgently? Maybe we could start with you, Torbjörn, if we just go in reverse order around the panelists.
All right. Yeah. Unfortunately, I think the first priority is making sure that Ukraine survives this winter, and that may actually need our support in terms of diesel generators and more weapons. I wish I could say something more positive for the environment, but we shouldn't forget that this process will be a long one, and there will be opportunities to build back better and greener. But I think for right now, making Ukraine survive the winter is the top priority from my point of view.
Thank you. Yeah, and of course, an interesting and important development yesterday with the US authorizing the transfer of Patriot and sort of strengthening Ukraine's air defenses, which will be a very important priority. Anna, please, main priorities or main priority.
As I just spoke too much, I will say shortly, weapons, and weapons. Of course, diesel generators, Ukrainians will, of course, I'm sure, and I have to be, as a Ukrainian, I have to stay positive. So I believe in our victory, but it all starts with the making sure that Ukraine does win and goes and moves ahead with all of those ambition projects which have been already developed today.
Okay, thank you. Cymie, listening to some of the legal arguments, you're sometimes sort of reminded of the Queen of Hearts in Alice in Wonderland, sentence first, verdict afterwards. But what would you say is the single most important thing to be thinking about right now?
Well, what's already been said, of course, is for Ukraine to win. I think what can be done for the environment now is to make sure that environmental disasters like hazardous materials spills that can get worse if not addressed are dealt with immediately, that there be real attention to that, and that non-human environment be considered when making that triage and collecting evidence, but using the appropriate methods. general people going around with phones is great, but it's probably not going to be adequate in a legal process. So,
very good. And of course, there's a huge problem also with mine contamination, landmine contamination, which is also a very difficult problem to deal with. So, Doug, please.
I think Cymie. So what I was going to say, but also being British and I enjoy my privilege of saying data rather than weapons. But also I think making that point that recovery is a continuum. It's not something which kicks in later, and that actually the data collection now, the immediate response and containment of hazardous materials at sites is part of the recovery process and should be viewed as part of the recovery process. So I think all of these things can be done now, can start now, are being done now to some extent. And then in addition to that, maintaining the attention on the environment. This is completely uncharted territory in terms of environmental attention for a conflict. And the question is, how can it be sustained? How it would be, I think the fear is that there's a lot of very aggressive environmental diplomacy, and then the question is, to what extent does the government follow up on that environmental attention as the conflict drags on, as the recovery begins? Is this just something which is used for diplomatic purposes now, or is this actually a genuine mindset of the Ukrainian government and something which will be reflected in the quality of environmental governance going forward in future?
A very important data set we need is measuring delivery on what's been promised, for sure. Nickolai, please.
Well, everything has been said, and I think everything is important. It is important to wage and win the war. It's also important to deal with the environment. Within the environment, it's important to deal with reconstruction, but also with evidence collection. Sometimes these things are seen as a step-by-step developments. Actually, they're not. They depend on each other, but many of them need to go in parallel. And as an example, evidence does get lost, information does get lost. So if we wait until things are over, if we don't do it now, we will not be able to recover some things later in terms of knowledge, in terms of the information that we will need for the later process, be it legal or construction or compensation or whatever. So I would say, unfortunately, all these things need to go in parallel, and maybe it's also a little bit of luck that there are interests in all of them coming from different sides. So some organizations, people are better at one and others are better at another. So I think what really matters is that these things do exist, they do work, and eventually converge. So I would say, yes, just keep on going. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you so much to all of the panelists. It's really been a fascinating and I think very important discussion, and it's really just the start of the process that we really need to go into much more deeply about how to help Ukraine in light of the enormous challenges that they're facing, but also to see what a number of you have pointed to, that there is opportunity in the catastrophe. The addition of more than 40 million well-educated, highly motivated people to the European project is an asset, and one that we need to take advantage of. So thank you again so much for everyone who's joined us online. Thank you once again to the panelists. And with that, the meeting is closed.